Jesse Sunquist, welcome back to Acquiring Minds.
Thanks, Will. Thanks for having me back.
Jesse, you came on the podcast last fall, 2022. You had been searching for a business to buy for a year, but didn't yet have your deal. And you wrote an essay reflecting on your psychology after a year of searching full-time, your process, and kind of the evolution of your search and your process. And you posted this essay on Search Funder. It got a lot of attention, and I invited you on to walk us through these reflections. It was really a great episode, a great essay. So, of course, I will be linking to that in the show notes. But happily, some months after that, you did find a business to buy, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The end of your search story and the beginning of your story as the owner-operator of a business. But please start us off, Jesse, with a reminder of who you are and why you decided to buy a business in the first place.
Yeah, certainly. So, my story really starts in the pandemic where, we all got sent home. We were working remotely. I had two small kids at the time. My wife and I were trying to work at home and manage the kids. And it was just a disaster, right? Like it was super stressful. We were watching the kids during the day, staying up till midnight or later to catch up on our corporate jobs. And, it just wasn't the lifestyle that we wanted. And, during that time, I had found out about ETA, entrepreneurship through acquisition. Sounded really interesting. So I started, devouring books and podcasts, and I was introduced to Search Funder and started going on there, and, was just thinking about it more and more and thinking like, hey, I think this is a viable path for me and my family in the future, right? To own an asset that we have, control over, how hard we work dictates how, the output, how much money we can make, but also like give me some flexibility as well, because that's really what we were struggling with was not having enough flexibility to be with our family with two parents that were working like pretty intense corporate jobs. So I was a tire kicker for a long time, probably like 9 to 12 months, was just, doing a little networking, reading things, filling out lead forms on BizBuySell, maybe getting a reply. Like every time I got a sim, I was so excited and I would dig into it, but I would never call the broker and, didn't really take much action. But, became more and more disillusioned with my corporate job and just becoming more and more convinced about ETA being a viable path that I decided, hey, if I was going to really take this seriously, like I needed to pursue it on a full-time basis and not do it sort of like part-time with my job. It wasn't really allowing me much time to search during the day. In the evenings, I was watching kids, so I couldn't really do it in the evenings. So, my wife and I had a conversation. We looked at our personal finances and our situation. We were living with our in-laws at the time, which, helped financially. And we decided that I was going to quit my job and pursue search full-time for at least a year and give it a fair chance. And then we'd sort of like reassess at the 1-year mark if I was making enough progress, if I was still interested, if I thought I could get a deal done. And if worst case scenario was I could always go back and get another corporate job, but I wanted to give search at least a year to give it a fair chance. And
two quick follow-ups to that, Jesse. The first is in what capacity was your corporate job? What was your background, your field?
Yeah, I started out my career as an auditor. I worked for Ernst & Young for 5 years, and then I sort of worked my way out of the back office, and I kept on getting closer to the front office, right? So I went into finance and accounting from there. Then I went into operations. I managed a small team of client managers. Then my last role was at a small software company where I was doing sort of like deal desk contract negotiation work for large software contracts.
Okay. And so it sounds like your motivation to buy a business was more about flexibility than it was about building wealth.
Yeah.
Respond to that.
That's
accurate?
That's absolutely correct. Something that I've reflected on a lot when I started my search was just how, personal it is. Like everybody's motivations are different. Everybody's, why as to why they're doing this is different. And, it gets very easy to, compare, play the comparison game with other people or other success stories, but, they have a different reason for doing things. They may have a different, different sort of like end game. I was actually listening to an episode this morning that you did recently where a guy was talking about IPOing his company that he bought, right?
Yep.
Which is awesome.
Meta.
It's incredible. But that wasn't my motivation, right? It was more around flexibility and yes, wealth building in the long term, but at least in the short term, having one parent be more flexible. With the ultimate end goal of 3 to 5 years from now, having enough sort of like financial mobility where the other parent can sort of like back away from their intense corporate job and spend their time differently and not have as much stress to be forced to make a certain level of income to maintain a lifestyle.
Yeah. Well, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, Jesse, but I'm struck that you keep talking about kind of your wife as the one with the intense corporate job, as if jumping into a small business is not going to be intense, as if you're going to have this, this breezy professional life that gives you all this flexibility. We'll get there.
Well, yeah, we will definitely get there. But like, she made, sacrifices for over a year while I was searching. And then, she had to make more sacrifices, in my first year of ownership, because you're right. It's not a walk in the park when you, step into being a new business owner. But we're figuring it out, and she's super supportive, and I couldn't do it without her.
Great. And she's, of course, still working really hard herself in whatever her job is. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, Jesse. So returning to the plot. So you guys together decide that this will be your path, and you get serious. You go full time on your search. You quit your W-2, and give us just real quick, like, take us up to the moment that you wrote that essay.
Yeah, it was the first year was a slog. It's every bit as difficult as people make it describe, or people describe it. And I forget if I mentioned this in my essay or not, but I was actually under LOI within probably like 2 months for my first deal, and I was like over the moon. Hey, this isn't supposed to happen this quickly. Like, so excited. It fell apart within the first 2 weeks of diligence. But it was probably the best thing that could have happened to me, because, getting under LOI, doing some preliminary diligence, talking to a bunch of bankers about an SBA loan, I just learned so much from that first experience, and it really prepared me for, the next, 12 to 16 months of my search before I closed. I think my first year to 14 months was a little atypical, because I actually had my third kid during that time. And, after we had our third kid, I didn't do anything for probably 6 weeks, right? I was just exhausted. And so I was just trying to keep up with the family. And, once I sort of got myself out of a hole of, changing diapers and stuff like that, I kicked it into gear again a couple months later. And that's sort of like phase 2 of my search, because phase 1 was getting this deal under LOI, having it fall through. The deal that fell through was a remote bookkeeping company.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a great little business. And after that, I was like, man, like this is so good. Like, why don't I just like build this from scratch, right? As opposed to like buying one. And so I went down the rabbit hole of probably 6 weeks about like thinking about and potentially launching my own, bookkeeping company instead. And I got to the finish line, and I couldn't pull the trigger. There was something about doing a solo effort by myself to launch something new that just didn't feel right. And once again, back to my why, like I didn't quit my job to like start something from scratch. I'm not really like a 0 to 1 type of guy. I'm more of an optimizer. And I think I knew that about myself, which was really holding me back from going about something by myself. So I put that aside, had my third kid, took some time off, and then was sort of rejuvenated to kickstart my search again after that.
Mm-hmm. And so where are we now? What month are we in now? Calendar month.
Probably like February. So I quit my job in August of 2021. We're now in February 2022.
Okay. All right. And then the essay comes out, what, probably July?
Yeah, probably July. I was coming up on that 12-month mark. And at that point I had, one LOI fall through. I had, 3 offers that were not accepted. And I had a 4th offer that, I was down the path of, negotiating the LOI. I felt really good about the seller, about the broker. I was very excited about it. But then, as we're negotiating the LOI, the seller's accountant finds out about the sale, and he's like, "Whoa!" He's like, "You're not going to make enough money from this to retire." He's like, "You got to work for another couple of years," and so the broker pulled the listing. And an unfortunate outcome. It's happened to a lot of other people before. And I think the broker was actually like this broker was really good. You could tell he felt like a little embarrassed by it, because he's a experienced broker and he probably should have, known better. But it happened. And so I had to pick myself up and keep looking up for the next deal.
Mm-hmm.
I should clarify that, a big thing that was different about my search than others was geography was my number one criteria. My wife and I had bought a house. My kids were in the school system. I was not looking across the country for any good deal. I was going to pick up and move. And so I started with a 2-hour radius from my house. And after a 1-site visit 2 hours away, I reduced it to a 1-hour radius from my house.
Yeah.
And, so that was the biggest sort of constraint in my search. which was good because it helped me focus, but it was also super frustrating because I felt like anything above $500,000 of SDEs, like I had looked at 3 times, right?
Yeah.
And it ended up being me trying to like force fit deals that I should have passed on into my criteria because it was within an hour of my house, right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of the wrong reason. And so I had to sort of change my criteria, and so I reduced the floor from 500K to 300K SDEs, and I found out there's a lot more deals in the 300K space, and so that was super helpful. But it became, I had to be a little more critical in my thought to think, okay, it's 300K now. Are you buying a job, or is this something that you think you can really grow in the future?
Well, but I suspect that you were comfortable with buying a job, at least in the immediate term.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Yes, buying a job, but then you could see a path to growing into something
Correct.
where it's
Am
no
I
longer
buying a job
and
in perpetuity, or can this actually grow and scale to be something where I can work my way out of a job and make it be something bigger?
And you were in Jersey, but geographically like a good 2 hours from New York sort of thing?
No, I'm like an hour south of New York City. I'm in Monmouth County.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But still, like, for people who maybe don't know that region super well, you're not in a super urban area, even though you're only an hour from New York. So the deal flow is pretty light.
Yep.
So a year comes and goes. You're feeling frustrated. Your wife is probably like, dude, we agreed to a year. What now?
She actually wasn't pushing me to stop at all. She was still very supportive. I was pretty frustrated after the first year because I realized just how hard it is to get any deal done, like how many things have to come together to successfully close a deal. I actually went through and went very far along the process of applying for another W-2 job, which that job I think would have been good. But after the final round of interviews, they were like, hey, sorry, we're doing a hiring freeze, like not going to work out. And so, I was disappointed about not getting a job that I thought I could actually do well. I looked at a bunch of other corporate jobs and just, wasn't excited about any of them. And I had a conversation with an older guy. I wouldn't call him a mentor, but an older guy who had some perspective. He's just like, look, quitting your corporate job was a really big step. Like, I would just encourage you to remind yourself why you did it. And if all those reasons are still valid, like, just give it a little more time. And then that was the exact advice that I needed at the time, because I was like, yeah, like all those reasons why I quit, they're still valid. Like, why would I go back to a corporate job that I wasn't excited about? And it was literally a matter of weeks after that conversation where I got an email from a broker, just one of their regular email blasts, and they had a franchise pest control company included on it. And, I had never considered franchises before. So I decided to be a little more open-minded, and it looked too good to be true, right? Like the multiple that they were talking about and the purchase price based upon the earnings, it looked too good to be true. So I was like, this can't be real. Something's wrong with it, but whatever. I'll just go, inquire about it. So I, gave them a call, requested more information, and, every conversation I had sort of like checked out. Eventually got to meet with the seller. He was the perfect seller profile, this guy in his mid-60s who was looking to retire and, pass on his legacy to a capable pair of hands. So I checked the box there, and everything sort of checked out. And despite the fact that it was franchised, it wasn't really a deterrent because I had many conversations with the franchisor. I had many conversations with other owners in the network, and every other owner that I spoke with, I asked them the same question at the end of the call, like, "Hey, would you recommend me doing this?" And they were all like, "Yes." Nobody had any regrets about the franchisor. They had some cautions and concerns, but nobody really tried to talk me out of it.
And were these franchisees that the franchisor had introduced you to? You always wonder if the franchisor is going to cherry pick the references that they put you in touch with.
Only one was. The nice thing about franchises is they're super transparent. Like, there's a thing called an FDD, franchise disclosure document, which is almost always public. There's some state websites you can go to get them if they operate in them states. And in the back of every FDD is every single owner along with their contact information. So it's super easy just to pick up the phone and cherry pick and start calling people. Even if you don't know anything about them, I can know that, like, hey, this person in Maryland owns 5 territories. Like, I'm going to give them a call because they probably have a pretty big business.
And you did that. You'd cold call them and say, hey, I'm looking at this territory in New Jersey, so I could be joining this network. Kind of, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. And how many of those calls did you have? How many franchisees did you talk to?
I probably talked to like 4 or 5 on my own, and then they recommended 1 or 2 other ones.
Mm-hmm.
So
that is so valuable. I mean, that's one of like 3 or 4 things about being in a franchise network that are just so incredibly valuable. And let's dwell on this, Jesse. Why? It's a theme that's come up many times on this podcast. People being kind of closed to doing a franchise and not even really considering it. And then either a franchise opportunity comes their way, a resale opportunity comes their way, and they look at, just like you, they look at it and they're like, well, what's not to like about this? Or something else opens their mind. They hear an interview with somebody who's bought a franchise resale or something else, and they just kind of take a second look at the entire concept and almost always warm to it. So that kind of opening of the mind, I find really interesting. Why do you think that you were not considering or not open to buying a franchise resale initially?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have a good reason, to be honest. It was really just the sort of like stigma and stereotypes around franchises. Like, oh, like you're paying a royalty for what? Like, what is a franchisor providing? Like, are you really running your own business? They're telling you exactly what to do. Like, you don't have control over the brand. Like, it was all pretty stereotypical, like nonsense. Like, none of them are really good reasons, why not to consider a franchise. But the real opening of the mind, came for me was, I met so many people in my search process, and I just happened to meet so many multi-unit franchise owners that were running wildly successful businesses in a franchise network. Like, some of them are doing 7-figure EBITDA, like in a franchise, not on the food space. And I was like, that's like serious. Like, these are businesses searchers would like kill for, those earnings.
Yeah.
And so I was like, man, if they can do that in a franchise network, like maybe I shouldn't ignore them. The number one thing with franchises is that you have to pick the right franchisor. And so and that's been written about a lot, but like, it's so true. And, there's a lot you can get into around like, do you want to buy into a small and emerging brand? Do you want to buy a mature brand? Somewhere in the middle? Like, once again, that becomes a sort of personal life decision. But at least for me, Mosquito, so the franchise I bought is a Mosquito Joe's. And Mosquito Joe has probably like 350 plus territories. So they're, not in the thousands, but they're clearly mature. They've been doing it for a while. Mosquito Joe, like 3 or 4 years ago, was acquired by Neighborly, which is a private equity-backed franchise holdco of 20 plus home service brands. So, they become successful on their own right. They were acquired by a private equity firm, and now they're under this private equity umbrella. And so there's credibility there, right?
Yeah.
So that really, that really was sort of comforting for me, right? I think in a different life stage, I would potentially consider buying into an emerging brand, buying 5 territories, and then rolling up the sleeves and building from scratch, because you can build, you can have a lot of, like, it's a grind, but you can have a lot of success doing that with very little debt or much less debt than doing a full business acquisition. But, I was very clear that I needed, cash flow or some sort of like income from day one. And so a franchise resale was really the only thing that I was considering.
Yeah. And just the flip side of that is that, okay, you're not taking on a lot of risk in terms of not needing to take a lot of debt, but where the risk is that you don't know that an emerging brand is necessarily going to be successful. It could sputter out. The early orange theory franchisees couldn't predict the phenomenon that it would become. So lucky them and good on them. But that's where the risk is.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I think my seller had owned this for 6 or 7 years. I think he was like the second territory in New Jersey. So Mosquito Joe was not popular, or even like successful in New Jersey by the time he bought in. But he bought in at a really good time, right? And I think, he bought in at a really good time, and it worked out well for him.
Jesse, let's just return a little bit to your loosening of your criteria around SDE, which you were basically forced to do based on the lack of deal flow because you were geographically constrained. This is something that comes up again and again and again. What size of business to buy? Your criteria had been what, 500,000-600,000 SDE and above?
Yep.
And it was just not happening. You kept returning to the same deals. I mean, it was a really, really light deal flow trickle. And then, so just kind of give us a little bit more detail on that process of going down to 300 and what changed and how you got comfortable with it.
Yeah, I mean, I had to, right? Like, if I wanted to get a deal done, like I was approaching the year mark, and with that, actually, I think I changed to 300 before the year mark, but I got to a certain point where I felt like I had seen everything, and I was just waiting for new deals to, come on the market, and I was like, well, this doesn't make sense. It's not a good use of time. I don't have like an infinite sort of like waiting time. So I decided to look smaller, which unlocked a lot of new deals that I hadn't really considered. But I think, like I was mentioning before, you really have to think through, is this going to stay 300-ish in perpetuity, or can you actually like grow it, right? Or do you think, is there the potential for it to become bigger? And, in some cases it's no. And so then that's a sort of like hard pass. But I think in a lot of cases it could be yes, right? Because there are, people have talked about this on Twitter and Search Funder all the time, right? There's a sort of like, to cross $1 million in revenue is is an accomplishment, right? And then it's like 1 to 5 or 1 to 3, I forget what it is like another sort of like zone, and a lot of businesses can't get out of that zone, right? So you have to have confidence in yourself as an operator, but also look at the business model and how they're operating today and say like, okay, do I think I could get it out of this dead zone that they're in into the next level?
Yeah. And so when you came down to 350 SDE and saw a lot more, that kind of unlocked deal flow, and you started looking at a lot of, seeing more SIMs and into more businesses, some of those you'd say to yourself, this thing really can't grow beyond this, or it can't break, the $1 million ceiling or the $3 million ceiling. And others you'd say, yeah, it could. I could definitely see this getting to 1, 3, 5 million and beyond. And the Mosquito Joe territory checked that box. What was its revenue at? Let's tie this in now to the business that you bought. Where was revenue for it, and why did you see a path to growth in this business and not in some of the others that you looked at?
Yeah, so I didn't want just one territory, right? Like I was like, man, like just one territory. That's with a franchise model, you're only given a certain territory that you can operate in, right? Which is good because you're not competing with the other Mosquito Joe franchise, 50 miles away. But it's bad because you're limited to, like in Mosquito Joe, they call them targeted households, right? You're limited to a certain number of targeted households, and you're only going to have enough penetration, right? So like, can I grow 5 to 10% a year? Yeah, but I'm not going to grow 40, 50% for 3 years because it's going to get saturated, So the play with the franchise is always that, it's so easy to do a roll up in a franchise because everybody's using the same systems, CRMs, like processes. And so the play there is really like get in with a good territory that's providing you with enough sort of like SDEs, your minimum amount of SDEs, and then see how you can grow within the network by acquiring other territories. So it was a little bit of a calculated bet, but once to your point earlier about franchises having a lot of transparency, in the diligence process, I can see some of the weekly leaderboards that are published. And I can see like, wow, this territory in New Jersey is a top 10% individual territory in all of the Mosquito Joe's network, right? Mm-hmm. And in the FDD, you can say like, here's what the average revenue is per territory. I can see at the revenue, that this guy's bringing in. I'm like, wow, it's significantly higher. This is a good territory, right? So I knew it was a well-performing territory, and that was that would give me a good sort of like foundation to operate from. And then it was a little bit of a calculated bet on, okay, in this not uber mature brand, but in this more mature brand, there's likely going to be other owners that are looking to retire in the next 3 to 5 years, and there's a good chance that once I'm in network, I'm a known quantity. I could be a very attractive buyer to another owner.
Yeah. Well, Jesse, this is just hitting on so many of the themes of the buying a franchise resale with the intent to roll up, basically. So Brian Beers talks about this a lot. He's been on the podcast with the Midas. He's the guy who's bought so many Midas locations around the Philly metropolitan area and beyond.
Yep.
And to your earlier point, which I meant to plug an episode of 2 weeks ago when you were talking about like once you've opened your mind to franchises and you think you want to buy a resale of a territory or a handful of territories or locations to then do programmatic acquisition and expand far beyond that, devoted a whole episode to that where we, with AJ Wasserstein, Michael Horowitz, and Peter Mistretta, who are, AJ being a professor, the other two being actual exemplars of this model, and the 10 questions you should ask yourself as your, like the framework to very systematically think through what franchisor to go with. So hard plug for that episode. It's a really solid one and really, really helpful. Those guys crushed it. So here you are. You are doing exactly that. You are going to buy a territory. You're looking at the potential of buying more territories in the future. You're looking at the age, the demographics of existing owners, and seeing that they're kind of boomerish, and that there you'll be waiting for them when it's time for them to retire or pass the torch. I'm I'm jumping around here a little bit, but one of the things you said was really interesting, how a Mosquito Joe territory is it's basically every territory has what did you say? A targeted number of households? Is that what, or targeted households is what the phrase
households.
was?
Yep.
So you can really see what the ceiling is here. So say the targeted households is 100,000 and the monthly fee to a household is, I don't even know what it costs, $100, let's call it. So that's $10 million potential in the territory. And you say, well, I'm not, that's the kind of total addressable market. And then you say, I'm only ever going to get 5% or 25% of the market. You could do some really quick napkin math to see kind of what the potential is of that territory. But then, of course, you can say, okay, well, that times 5, if I were able to get to 5 territories, or that times 15 territories. It's also interesting is that you can really dissect this. It's very interesting. So you can not only look at, look at the territory that you're contemplating buying and seeing the targeted households there, but look at the immediate neighboring territories and see what those targeted households are. So you could almost not only just play the game of like, well, if I get to 5 and 10 and 50 territories, but you could actually look at like, well, if I do a contiguous play where I'm just getting the territories right around me, I mean, you could see right there in the FTD, right? What their revenue is, maybe not what their targeted households is.
So,
I mean, are you doing all this analysis, or is this like more than most? Am I overdoing it here?
No, you're not off the mark. I think I did a lot more of that once I was in network and understood it a little bit better. But yeah, you can absolutely do math like that. I don't think they post, in the FDD, every franchisor is going to post different levels of information. Some post a lot, some post a little. I think Mosquito Joe is, they post an okay amount. They're not going to say I think they may say the average they have like quartiles and average revenue per the top quartiles or whatever. So you're never going to see like how much revenue each owner is doing, but they'll give you sort of like averages. But if you know that an owner has 5 territories, and you can say what the average territory revenue is, like, oh, well, then you can sort of like guess at to approximately what their revenue is. Back of the envelope type stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think they try to make the targeted households pretty consistent. So if you're paying a franchise development fee of a certain amount of money, they want to make sure that the playing field is level. And so one person is not getting 100,000, targeted households for that cost, and somebody else is getting 20,000 households for that cost,
sure.
Right? So they try to make it a little bit level playing field now. I don't know how that was, 6 or 8 years ago, but at least now you know that if you have a territory, there's probably a similar number of targeted households.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, you can do all sorts of math around like penetration rate, average cost per spray, and stuff like that to say what is the potential of this?
Is there anything more to say about why you like this business and any of the parameters of the business?
Yeah, I mean, it's a simple business, right? It's not an easy business, but it's a simple business. You have guys in trucks that complete a spray, right? We don't go inside the houses. There's a couple other like auxiliary services, but our bread and butter service is outdoor mosquito barrier sprays. And so you come up with dense routes, you set the guys up with materials, you send them out, they complete the sprays and they come back, right? It's not rocket science. You know what I mean? Like, it's very easy to learn. You provide a service that customers are very happy with. Like Mosquito Joe's whole thing is like make outside fun again, right? And like, I've done the spray in my house, like it works, and so like we can actually go outside and not be bit by mosquitoes. And when people are happy with that, like they come back year after year, right? And so like we have very high retention rates. It's not recurring per se, like a SaaS product, but like people are coming back year after year. We have very high retention rates. Referrals are our number one acquisition source, and so when people are happy, they tell their friends about it. So it's nice to get a referral versus having to pay hundreds of dollars for a pay-per-click ad. Even though we do that obviously, but referrals is the number one lead source, which is really encouraging. And it's just not a hard business. So that was attractive. Super high gross margins, also attractive. And I think there's a lot of potential for roll up as well. And so like it has a lot of the characteristics that most searchers are looking for. And so it sort of like fit the bill for me. And I think I got to a point in time in my diligence process, and I was like, if I can't pull the trigger on this, like, I'm never going to buy a deal, right? Like, did I want to be into like outdoor pest control? Like, not necessarily, but I think there's enough attractive areas of the industry and of the business itself that it's a great business to own.
Yeah. Couple follow-ups there, Jesse. You said it's actually not technically recurring. So I as you know, I talked to Neil Finneran.
Mm-hmm.
I've already recorded that interview. It will be airing around the same time as this one. Neil bought a territory in Massachusetts, I guess.
Yeah.
I characterized his business as a recurring one, but it's actually not. You don't have them on automatic billing your customers, or you only go when they call, or what's that look like?
So we have a 21-day cycle that we come out and treat, but we don't have any contracts. And so most people will sign up and set it and forget it. We come out every 21 days and they're happy, but you have some people that are like, oh, I'm on a vacation for 2 weeks, skip this one, or I'll just call you when I want you to come out. And those customers are more annoying, but you're not going to say no to them, right? But because we are non-contractual, people can start and stop whenever they want. I have a hard time calling it recurring, but for the most part, most people sign up for the regular barrier spray. We come out every 21 days and treat your property until you tell us to stop or the season ends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Yeah, that's kind of right on the edge of recurring. I guess it's kind of recurring, but your customers have the option of having it not be recurring.
Yeah. Yeah. And most of our customers are on auto pay with their credit card. So after we do the service, the credit card's charged, boom, it's easy. But
yeah. You said that they're super high gross margins, but this is also a bit, one of the things not to like about pest control is that the barriers to entry are pretty low. So, anybody with, some spray equipment, some chemicals, and a truck is in business. So you'd think that there, a lot of that margin would be competed away. So square that circle for me.
Yeah, it's barriers to entries are low. You do have to be licensed to be able to buy the product that you need, but then also apply the product as well. So you have to go through a licensing process to be able to do this, but it's not that difficult, right? And so anybody can get licensed and then buy a truck and a blower and be up in business. And so the competitive pressure does increase year after year, which will probably push down gross margin over time. But like I said, at least, with referrals being the number one lead source, if you have a good customer base to work from, that just sort of perpetuates the flywheel, right? Of existing customers referring other customers. And then you're able to, you have a little bit of a moat that way versus somebody who's starting out with a guy in a truck and is I'm just going to undercut Mosquito Joe and, get some market share. And then they're really sort of hustling. It's going to take them years to really eat away at us. But we do see it in certain areas, One guy in a truck goes out there and, tries to make a name for itself and undercuts our price. And, we do lose some customers. Mosquito Joe will never claim to be the lowest cost provider, nor will we ever be the lowest cost provider. But, we stand by our services and we do a good job. And like I said, having a good solid customer base to work from really perpetuates the acquisition flywheel.
Yeah. Excellent. And tell us a little bit more detail about what the business actually does. When you spray, what are you spraying? How does it work? Does it kill mosquitoes, or is it just kind of something that keeps them away that they don't like the smell of, or whatever? What's it? Give us a picture.
Yeah, so we have a couple different options, right? Our standard spray is what they call a synthetic pesticide, which is a man-made pesticide. We'll come out and treat the perimeter of your property and all your foliage, and any mosquito that lands on an area that's been treated, it will die. And so that's sort of one aspect of it. We'll always treat any sort of standing water that we see. And so if a mosquito lays eggs there, then the eggs won't be able to hatch and grow into a full-grown mosquito. We're moving more towards what they call a botanical treatment, which is all natural, all organic products. But because you have a bunch of all natural products that are mixed together, they can't be called organic anymore. They have to call it botanical. But essentially, it's essential oils and soaps, which also will kill mosquitoes as well. And so we're trying to move more in that direction to be more eco-friendly. And then the third sort of treatment option that we have is just a repellent, right? And so you spray it. It's these different types of essential oils, which emits a aroma that will actually just drive the mosquitoes away, but won't kill them.
Mm-hmm. And I assume the repellent is the least effective, unhappily.
The repellent, we have to actually come out every 2 weeks instead of every 3 weeks because it doesn't last as long. But I think it's important to note, especially in certain areas of the country, that our treatment is effective for mosquitoes, ticks, and fleas. And in New Jersey and further north in New England, ticks are a major concern. And so a lot of our business at the start of the season and at the end of the season is because ticks are active anytime the weather is greater than 55 degrees. And so we have some customers, our best customers, they're spray me the last week of March because I know it's going to be 50 degrees. and don't stop until the end of October, right? Because I have dogs and I live, on the edge of the woods, and I don't want them getting any ticks.
Well, Jesse, this is a seasonal business, as you keep alluding to, and we're kind of right at the end of the season here, I guess October. So you haven't yet experienced a cycle of going through an off season. So you probably can't speak to it with experience, but you were certainly thinking about that as part of your decision making process for whether or not to get into a seasonal business. How did you think about it? How are you thinking about it now?
Yeah, so my thinking has evolved, right? I think the most important thing is that it's doing 12-month revenue numbers in a 7 to 8 month period, right? And so it's like it becomes a cash flow management exercise for me in the off season. More than anything else, because I'm doing the full year cash flow in a more condensed time period. I think before I got started, I was, I literally had a file on my phone. I was thinking about like, what are some other businesses I can do in the off season to, retain some employees, make some money, and really like grind it out for those 4 or 5 months. I got to about the midway point of the season, and I'm like, I'm not doing any of that this year. In the future, maybe, but at least for now, like I'm so looking forward to the opportunity to work a little bit less. Spend some more time with my kids, and really like it becomes a planning exercise for what I want to do next season. I think the unique aspect of this business is that I'll have 3 or 4 months where I can reflect on what went well last season, what didn't go well, and what do I want to do differently. And then when I start up again next year, I'm going to hire probably 50 to 60% of my workforce is going to be new in first year to Mosquito Joe. And so I can launch some things with them next year that they're just going to think is business as usual, but is actually like new and different for, the 2024 season than how we operated in 2023.
That I feel like is a kind of profound difference between seasonal businesses and not. The change management is less because you sneak in change. And if you're hiring new people every season, then they don't have to adjust to your changes or resist your changes. Now, Jesse, why are 50 to 60% of them going to be new? Is that just the nature? How are you projecting that number?
Because I have to lay off my entire workforce at the end of the year. And it's unfortunate, but like I can't, if I'm not making money in the off season, I can't retain them on payroll. And so I have a couple of guys that they just go on unemployment in the off season and they'll come back, next year. Some guys, I have a few college guys that I'm pretty bullish will come back next year because they've enjoyed themselves this season. But I had at peak, I was probably at like 12 technicians this year. 4 of them, actually 5 of them came back from last year to this year. And so I'm just assuming that, a similar number.
I think now, Jesse, we can get into how it's gone, basically. So once you bought the business, before we do that, was there anything to say about the actual closing or deal negotiation? Actually, tell us what the business was. Give us some numbers around the business. I don't think you've done that yet.
Yeah. So the territory that I bought was doing just under $1 million of revenue, and I'll say that I lowered my floor to $300K, and it exceeded that. On an SDE basis. So that gives you can back into that math.
Yep.
The closing was interesting because the seller really didn't want to run it again for another year, and because I had to get licensed in the off season, like. You can buy the business without being licensed, but you can't operate until you have your license, right? So we all knew that the season was going to close at the end of October, so we didn't want to close before the end of the season. But I needed to have enough time to buy the business and get licensed before I had to hire people and buy product next March, right? So that gave me a sort of like 5-month window. Well, we didn't close until we got delayed. We didn't close till the end of December, like after Christmas, between Christmas and New Year's we closed, which that gave me about like 3 months to go through my Mosquito Joe training, get licensed, hire technicians, transfer all the trucks for the DMV, and do a whole bunch of other transition stuff so that I'd be ready to launch on day one. Now, I was fortunate in that like I didn't have a business to operate during that time, so I had a lot of time to focus on passing my exams, waiting in line at the DMV, and doing some of those other things that would have been hugely distracting if I was trying to run a business at the same time.
Yeah.
But it was sort of like a little bit of a race against the clock. Like I didn't spend nearly as much time on season opening procedures this year because I was spending all my time on like licensing procedures and transition procedures. So, I have a lot of ideas for things I can do differently to make me more efficient next year that I can do in, January, February, March. But I didn't have the opportunity to this past year. But the one thing I did want to add was my thesis around rolling up Mosquito Joe's territories started to prove itself very quickly. Like I said, I closed at the end of December. I got access, like they didn't give me a new email account. I got access to the owner's email account so I could see all the history. So of course I'm going through and like trying to learn as much as I can and reading things. And I came across an owner in Pennsylvania whose territory is right across the river from mine. My office is right outside Trenton. So this guy was in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And he actually reached out to my seller, and he'd owned his territory for probably 6 years. He reached out to my seller and was like, hey, like I'm super frustrated. I want out. Do you want to buy my territory? And of course, my seller was like in the process of selling his territory, so the conversations never went anywhere. But I follow the email thread and I figure out that like this guy's so frustrated. He's at the point of just returning the territory to Mosquito Joe and walking away with nothing. So I call him up and I said, hey, like I'm the new owner. Took over from this guy. You know, I'm right next to you. Like, are you still thinking about getting rid of your territory? And he was overjoyed. And he was like, yes, like I would love to get rid of it. I don't want to give it back to Mosquito Joe. Like I can sell it to you, blah, blah, blah. And so long story short, we, he sent me some information. I was able to look at it. Like the amount of revenue he was doing was irrelevant because this guy was essentially an absentee owner. He hired some people to manage it. They did it really poorly. He didn't really oversee it. It was a really mismanaged territory, but I knew I could see like what his target population was. I could see the density of where the households were. And I could see that the majority of his customers or the majority of his target households was a 20-minute drive from where my office was. So I was like, I could run this out of the same, I can run the trucks out of the same garage. I can run the office out of the same office. Like, boom, this is a slam dunk. So him and I negotiated a deal pretty quickly where instead of walking away with nothing, he's going to walk away with something. We had a seller finance deal. And so I was able to acquire my second territory 6 weeks to 2 months after I bought the first one.
That's God, what a stroke of luck. That's awesome, Jesse. And so just to be clear, it was doing, you said kind of like a negligible amount of revenue?
Like 150K or something like that.
Okay. But that's still more appealing to buy those customers generating 150K than having it kind of go back to Mosquito Joe and then you being granted the territory or whatever. Like it's still, there's still enough of a business there that it was, that it's a head start into that territory.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, like I said, what he was doing before was kind of irrelevant because he wasn't actually working in the business. But the fact that like I could take all of the overhead and like run it out of the same office was like, it was a no-brainer. And it really was about the potential of the territory versus what they were doing beforehand. Yeah. And I think the interesting thing is like that territory, that neglected territory would make no sense for a new buyer to sort of like buy. There wasn't enough there, but as a sort of like add-on to an existing territory, we can just like fill in. It's a slam dunk.
And not to mention you got it for a song. So it was fully seller financed?
Yeah. Fully
seller financed and a low price, presumably.
Presumably.
That's great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And did it all work out? So you said this happened right at the beginning of your tenure. So you've now had a season in both territories. Did it work out? Is the integration as easy as you'd hoped? Are you running it all out of the office that I see behind you, over your shoulder there?
Yeah. I mean, the thesis definitely panned out. I think the most challenging part was because it was in Pennsylvania and not New Jersey, that's a separate licensing district. And so now I have to go through the Pennsylvania licensing process, the New Jersey licensing process. I have to understand the differences between the two. Can I use the same technicians? Do I have to use, do I have to get technicians duly licensed? So there's a whole bunch of stuff like that I had to figure out. And, Mosquito Joe helps you out with it, but it's still just like a lot to sort of like keep that separate in your mind. And, fortunately, even though the territory was poorly managed, they did have one technician that came over with the sale. And this guy is a rock star. He's been a total stud and really, really helpful during the first year because, going from a much smaller base, but that territory has performed really, really well this year in its first year.
And so do you envision if you bought a third territory that you kind of just get better at it? It would be easier. You kind of know you've been through it once. You've got one rep under your belt.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I had 2 returning office staff from last year, which has been great. And I asked, one of the ladies recently, I was like, has it been really difficult, like having Pennsylvania and New Jersey, like how much harder has it been this year versus last year? And she's like, it's no different, right? Like it's the same CRM. Like I can look up the same, like, yeah, the notes are worse in the Pennsylvania territory, but like essentially to process a payment and to schedule them and do all that stuff, like it's no different.
Yeah.
So yeah, they haven't
Amazing.
felt overwhelmed by, having those additional customers come over.
You just mentioned how Mosquito Joe will help you with some of the licensing and educating you on differences between two territories in different states. What else have you found being a franchisee? So now that you're inside a franchise network and can really see the benefits or not of being inside a franchise network, what would you tell people about your experience?
So there's good and bad to it, right? I will say I don't want to spend too much time on the bad because that's not really the point. But I think, I came from the corporate world, so I know that I know how to smile when people want you to smile, and go attend things when you think that they're silly, and yeah, there's a lot of that you have to sort of hoops that you have to sort of jump through because like I said, Mosquito Joe is owned by Neighborly. Neighborly is private equity backed. They're corporatizing a lot of things, so there's a little bit of a corporate vibe around there, but I still feel like it's my business to run. I still have a lot of latitude. And so, yeah, there are some things that are a little bit annoying, but the pros outweigh the cons big time. And I think, the two biggest benefits for me are, one is just the owner's network. We've mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I feel like the franchise owners network is such a freaking cheat code. It's it's almost, I have people that are doing the exact same business that I am, who know exactly what I'm going through and that aren't competitors, and they're happy to share anything, right? It's incredible. Neil, for example, Neil bought the territory a few months after I did. We're both first-year owners of franchise resales in Mosquito Joe. Him and I are texting all the time. He picks up the phone to call me to be like, dude, terrible week. Listen to what my technician did, and it's awesome, right? I have, like I said, I have some friends on a WhatsApp group that I talk with all the time as well. And, we can share war stories about our different businesses, but they're very different, right? And so they can empathize, but they can't fully understand, just like I can't fully understand what they're going through. But the Mosquito Joe franchise owners have been amazing. And they come from all sort of different walks of life as well. There's younger guys in their, 20, late 20s, early 30s who have a W-2 job and are launching in Mosquito Joe's territory and they're grinding. And then you have a bunch of owners that are sort of second career type people, like my old owner who worked a corporate world for a long time and then not ready to retire yet, but they wanted to do something else. And so they bought this seasonal company. And so they have a very sort of different perspective, but it's just been incredible to have access to the owner group because everybody's super willing to talk and, share their best practices and their learnings. So that's been worth every hoop I have to jump through being in a franchise. The second is, Mosquito Joe is they've demonstrated themselves to be a really good franchisor. And one example of that is we had a customer reach out, they weren't accusing us of anything, but they were just really confused. They're like, look at my plants. I think your spray is killing my plants. I don't know what's happening, but this is thousands of dollars worth of horticulture. And now it looks like it's all dying. And so as a first year owner, I don't know enough about it. I don't think our spray is killing your plants, but I needed some talking points. And so I emailed the pictures and I forwarded this guy a note to Mosquito Joe Corporate. And within 2 hours, I had a response back from Mosquito Joe saying this is not from our spray. We think it's X, Y, and Z. They can also do A, B, and C to sort of follow up on that with this horticulture group to really identify what the species of, I think it's a grub or something like that was going after the plants. Boom, within 2 hours. And I was that's amazing. So I was able to sort of send that over to the customer and he, felt better about things after that. But, they were able to support you with areas where you really need support like that, which has been priceless.
One of the things that you said about that why people might not like franchises is, are you really running your own business or are you running somebody else's business, or it's not you don't feel like you're fully autonomous? Respond to that now.
Yeah, no, I do, right? Yes, there's certain parameters that I don't have flexibility over, but I do feel like it's my business. I have, I have the opportunity to make operational changes and tweaks to fit my sort of territory and my operating style. And, that's been really fun. And that's not corporate driven, right? They'll give you a playbook for here's some best practices, but you don't have to use it, right? You can also modify it as well. And so, yeah, I definitely feel like I'm running my own business. I think, there's, even within a franchise network, there's still so many decisions you have to make as a small business owner that it can be overwhelming. But I'm super thankful that I don't have to think about certain decisions what CRM am I going to use, right? Like I'm told what CRM to use, and is it perfect? Like no, but I don't have to think about like, should I change it? Like, should I talk to a bunch of vendors about seeing if we can get a better CRM? Like, I don't have to worry about that. I just have to learn about the nuances of the existing CRM and how to sort of like best manage it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I appreciate that there's certain decisions that have just been like, you know, given to you, and like, this is what you do, right? Like they have a whole bunch of like print vendors that I don't have to use, but like they have all the Mosquito Joe templates and everything. So it's really easy to like, order with 3 clicks online with them, or I can go through and like engage a bunch of other print vendors and like share with them the copies and go back and forth on proofs and stuff like that. I could do that, but like, it's not worth the time for me.
Yeah. Well, in our pre-call, you had actually talked about some of the improvements that you have made that, you took advantage of your autonomy and made them. And so let's get into a few of those. One was actually about the kind of nightly routine of printing the routes for the next day. So talk about what you did there.
Yeah, so routing is super important, like, because you have to have tight routes, so your technicians aren't like wasting a bunch of time. They call it windshield time, driving around between services. You want them to have as little driving as possible. The challenge is I can set the route at 10 a.m. in the morning, but we send notifications to the customer the day before, and so we're getting responses all throughout the day into the evening about like, hey, tomorrow's not good for me. I have my landscapers coming, or like, I'm on vacation this week. Can you skip? Or things like that. So there's constantly changes happening to the routing. So, routing can't really be locked down until as late as possible. Well, what was happening in the beginning of the season was I had an office staff who was in the office, and she would print the routes at like 6:00, but then I was at home and I would see a bunch of changes come through over email. And so there's sort of like one of two things that can happen. We can stay with the old routes and then have to sort of like coordinate in the morning about like, this person's a skip, or like this person needs service, between 12 and 2 instead of 9 and 10, or, something like that, which is logistically kind of complicated. Or we can just print the routes in the morning once we've gotten through all the changes. And so, and also I didn't want my office staff to have to stay till the office till 7:00 at night because she was printing routes and going through them, right? It wasn't a good use of time. And so I discovered a way where I could do all the routes at night at home, and then I would upload a file to a printer in the office, and then my head technician would come in the morning, and he will print out the routes in the morning, which is the final basically. And then there's no more changes. Then he gives them to the technicians, and they're out on the road. So it was a small sort of like operational tweak, but like it saved a ton of time and sort of like, headache and sort of like potential for miscommunication between, a change being made between 6 p.m. and, 6 a.m. When the routes were printed the night before.
And was that something that you came up with, or was that something that somebody in the franchise network shared with you as their technique?
No, I came up with that one on my own.
And have you shared it with the other owners? Given back to the network?
I haven't yet. I think, my situation is a little different because the garage is about an hour from my house. So it's not close. So I'm not in every day, actually. I have somebody in the office every day, but it's not always me. And so I think a lot of the other owners, they just like take it upon themselves, or like they'll stay until 8:00 at night and print routes, or they'll show up at 6:30 in the morning before, the other guys get there, and they'll print the routes. But like, I don't have that luxury. And so like I was sort of like forced by necessity to come up with a solution that worked for me. And so I think this works really well.
Yeah. Great. Good for you, Jesse. And what about the outsourced call answering, another operational improvement you put in place?
So, yeah. So it was actually this idea came from another business owner, friend of mine, who owns a swim club and a squash club nearby. And I was having breakfast with him one day, and I was just explaining how, I had a couple resources that, we weren't getting a lot of calls certain times a day, but I had a person there just to be able to answer the phone. It was like kind of expensive, and he was sharing with me that he has an outsourced call center that is like answers 100% of his calls. Now, he's got much less sort of like call volume, but basically this outsourced call center is US based experts on the phones that they support they support a bunch of different businesses, and they're just like really good on the phone. And so he's like, you should like have a conversation with them. So before I had a conversation with them, I actually posted a position to try to hire somebody in my office to be there to answer phones and follow ups on leads. And just the candidate pool was like really poor, and I was getting no-showed a lot on my office staff job. So finally I was like, you know what? Well, I had two things happen. one, I was frustrated by the candidate pool, and two, one of my office staff was going on vacation for a month. She had this big vacation plan, so I was going to be down a person. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to try this outsourced call center and see how it goes. And it's gone really, really well. So basically, my phone in the office rings 3 times, and then after that, it gets forwarded to the call center, and they're able to pick up. We worked on a script so they know how to answer the phones. They have access to our CRM system, so they can do basic things. But the biggest thing that they do is they'll just take messages and then they send it to us on Slack, and then we're able to sort of like follow up on things. So for year one, at least I'm calling this year one, I have somebody who will always answer the phone during business hours, so it never goes to voicemail, which is super important. And they're able to do sort of like basic tasks like take updated credit card numbers and do things like that. But I think for year 2, there's a potential where I can train them to actually follow up on leads and do some other sort of follow up on leads, but also do some outbound calls around reschedules, season opening, things like that. And which will be hugely beneficial because I've done the math 100 different ways, and I think they're actually cheaper than having another sort of like full-time resource in the office.
Well, it reminds me of the kind of one of the tropes you hear about small business ownership and how uncompetitive it is, because as long as you just like return calls, you're in the top 90th percentile of small businesses. I think that, of course, is not very accurate and an overstatement of the reality, but there's probably something to it.
There's definitely something there. Yeah, I think it's a little bit of overstatement, but there's definitely something there. And I think, answering the phone is super important. So yeah. I feel like the other thing about this call center is there's like 5 different people that could pick up the phone, right? So it's not like if I miss it in my office, there's only one person. If she's on another line, then she misses it. Like there's 5 different people that can pick up. And so I'm basically guaranteed that it's going to get answered.
Yeah. Yeah. Jesse, one of the kind of interesting observations that you had about the nature of this business when we talked in the pre-call was if you're going to be in a B2C business, consumer business, you either are, if you're in home services, you're probably having your crews go into people's yards, in your case, or homes. Or if you were something else, a gym, a salon, a restaurant, or anything where there's an office and consumers come to you, you can control your environment more. But then the general public is, walking into your home, as it were. So both of those have cons to them. But what is life like when you're sending out your crews into people's yards and, there's just constant interaction between your team and the public in, the very spaces that they're most protective of, their homes?
Well, I'm really glad that we don't go into homes. Let's put it that way, because I have enough problems with only being outside the home. I don't have a Ring cam myself, but I was shocked at the percentage of our customers that have a Ring cam, because our technicians are constantly being watched, and I get it, right? But this is the reality, and we tell technicians on day one, like, assume that everybody's watching you, assume that everybody has a camera. Because they likely do, But I think, even on the outside of people's homes, some people have elaborate gardens, some people have very particular landscaping, and we have some really detailed notes out of how to treat some people's houses, which becomes, I have to be able to trust my technicians to actually be able to read notes and follow instructions, right? Like I've had a couple of very angry phone calls from people who had things sprayed that shouldn't have been sprayed, right? And it was in the notes and the guy missed it. And you have to sort of like, just apologize and do the best you can, I think on the flip side, there are some people's yards that are an absolute disaster. And even though you come out to treat it, they still call you and they're angry because they still have mosquitoes. And it's like, well, you have like 6, old tires that all have water in it and we can't empty them out every time. Like you have to cut your grass, things like that. And so it becomes really challenging, The one thing that I didn't anticipate or, think about asking during the diligence process was, how often is your service actually like disputed, Because I would say at least every week I get a phone call or an email, or our office gets a phone call or email saying like, why did I get this invoice? You guys were never here. Or like, how do I know you were there? Like the guys are supposed to put a door tag on the door. They're supposed to put a flag in the ground to show they've done it. Sometimes they just don't do it. Or sometimes like they put the door tag on and it blows off, right? And they can't find it. But like, if you're not home and the technician doesn't make contact with you, like people will actually dispute the service because like, you were never here. There's been a couple of, and if they have a Ring camera, that becomes a little bit easier, like because they don't show up on the cameras. If they don't have a camera, but there was nothing left, it's like, yeah, like we can check the GPS. We have GPSs in our truck, so we can sort of like see where the truck was, how long they were there, and use that as evidence. But more times than I care to admit, we've had conversations with customers around like, were you guys even here? How am I supposed to know if you actually did the spray?
Yeah.
And so that's been challenging. We've thought about potentially taking a picture of the house every time, or something like that, like something like Amazon does when they deliver your packages, to ensure that like, yep, I was here. Here's the timestamp. I don't know if we'll actually do anything with that, but disputing the service was something I didn't anticipate would have happened. That happens, unfortunately, too often.
Jesse, one of the themes from my conversation with Neil Finneran was kind of what a dramatic pivot this was in his career to buy a Mosquito Joe franchise territory. He had worked in hedge funds and other kind of highfalutin, high finance roles in his career, and now it has a territory. And sometimes, because he bought relatively small, he's actually the one out spraying. And he signed up for that. But it's of course always interesting to hear somebody contrast their now life with their previous life when there is such a dramatic contrast. So what about you? You come from corporate and you're now doing the same thing. So are you ever out spraying? And then also just generally talk about what life feels like now.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely done my stint in the truck. Usually it's when somebody calls off day of or has to go home sick midday or something like that, and there's just an immediate need, and so if I'm in the office, I can fill it. It's not my preferred, but I think it's also like super important for me to understand what these guys are going through, and it's also important for me to understand like, hey, if I'm putting this many stops on your route and I think it should take you this amount of time, like I should feel comfortable that I'm not asking them to do it too quickly or I'm not putting enough on their plate, right? So the times that I've gone out, and I've probably been out 4 or 5 times, it's been helpful for me to sort of like see the pace that I can work when I'm textbook following exactly what they're supposed to do, and I can tell you how long a spray is going to take. So if anything, it's been like a really good learning experience for me, but it's not certainly not something I look forward to, right? There was a couple instances where I knew the guys had like really big days. I was in the office, I had some bandwidth, and so I was like, hey guys, like I'm available to spray with you for a few hours. Like, let me know if you want me to help out. And guess what? There's no takers because nobody wants to work with the boss. But that's normal. I don't take it personally. Yeah, so I think there's the actual spraying treating job, right, which I've had to step up and do. There's the answering the phones and responding to customers, doing lead follow up. Like I do more of that, but I still try to only be like the escalation point on the phone and not the primary one picking up the phones. And I've done that pretty successfully, which has been good. I think that the most value that I add right now is around the routing, because that logistical component is super important around making sure that the routes are dense and the guys aren't wasting their time driving around. And honestly, that feels kind of like corporate because I sit at home remotely and do it all, right? So there's not a whole lot different from there. But yeah, it's hugely different, but like I'm enjoying the learning. I've learned so much this year, and am thankful that there's been no like catastrophes, right? Knock on wood, I still have 6 weeks left, but there's been no real catastrophes, and I've learned a ton, and the business is performing well. So I'm just, I'm having a good time. It is giving me a lot of flexibility, and I'm really happy with how things have worked out so far.
Great. So you're basically feeling pretty solid about life and about this decision.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't regret it for anything.
And how do you feel about the SDE number that you acquired, Jesse? Because you did lower your SDE threshold of what you were willing to buy from the 500, 600, 700 that we're all advised we should, down into the 3s, and that in fact is the size of business that you bought. How has that felt?
It's felt fine, right? Like I think if anything else, it's more of like a not like a shame thing, but it's like oh, like I don't want to be the guy that said like I bought a super small company, or it's like, oh, it's embarrassing because my friends have bought like $700,000 SDE companies, and I just bought this like little one. If anything, I have like a mental block about it. But like it's felt fine. And once again, my wife is still working. She's still making, like, she's still the primary breadwinner. I've taken very little salary, this year. So her and I are more thinking about the next couple of years about like, okay, how much can Mosquito Joe grow? should I focus on paying down debt or pay myself a higher salary? What's our sort of like immediate needs? Like I have some flexibility, which is good. Like I'm purposely not taking much of a salary to sort of figure out like if I want to plow it back into, or keep it in the business and use it to pay down debt, or if I want to, if we have some immediate needs for our family, I can take a higher salary or something like that. So trying to figure some of that out, but like I have levers, I have flexibility, and I do see a path. If I don't acquire any other territories, I do see a path for growth in the next couple of years. But if I can acquire a couple more territories in the next 3 years, then I think I'll have a good enough sized business where my wife could possibly quit her job or take another job that she would earn significantly less, but that she would have a lot more time and flexibility with.
Mm-hmm. And actually, Jesse, to your point about kind of being in your head about the size of business that you bought, that was one of the themes in your reflections essay, circling back to that search is so personal. Don't waste your time comparing yourself to others. So just talk a little bit about the hazard of comparing yourself to others. That was actually a theme that was brought up on the episode that aired today with Shane Ursum. So let's hear your perspective on that, please.
Yeah, I just think it's not, I mean, look, everybody's going to do it. Everybody's human, but it's just not healthy and it's not a good use of your time. And I think you'll drive yourself crazy and get super depressed if you just look at other sort of like success stories or other people that are doing things that are, different or quote unquote better than you, and it's easy to get yourself like beat up and super down about it. So, I mean, look, I fall into the same trap, right? Like I don't go around broadcasting like, oh, I bought something in the mid 300s SDEs, like, yeah, like that's, once you pay down debt and stuff like that, like I was probably earning more in the corporate world,
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't feel good, but I do think that, this is not a 1 or 2 year decision, right? This is a literal lifestyle and career change for me. And so I think, over the next decade, I have a lot more earning potential and will walk away with a lot, I'll have an asset that's worth a lot more than anything that I would have had, continuing my W-2 job. And that's the most important thing to focus on. And because, like I said, it's personal. This is, my wife and I's situation and what works for us. And, thinking about going public or, something like really big, like it just is not a good use of mind share. I have enough things that, I have to think about and consider.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and also just reminding oneself of like, what your own why was, which was flexibility before wealth. And if that was your goal, you're well on your way to achieving that already. And so that's a huge accomplishment.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to, I'm going to pick up my kids from the bus stop. Like I actually already have been picking them up from the bus stop since I've been back at school, and I'll do that probably for the rest of the year, which is like super important for me. We don't have to have an after school babysitter because it's me and I can spend more time with them. And, right now when they're really young, that's super important because they're excited to see me when they get off the bus, right? Like that's not always going to happen, but at least for now, I want to, take advantage of that.
Excellent, Jesse. Well, anything that I didn't ask you that you wanted to make sure was said?
Yeah. I mean, I think we mentioned this in the pre-call. I don't know how relevant or how apparent it came out now, but like I never had one of those like on the floor of the bathroom moments so far this year, right? Like I haven't
fetal position.
Yeah, fetal position. Never had one of those. But it is tough. It is really tough, and it's not for the faint of heart. And I think it's really hard to get a deal done, but it's also really hard to operate after the fact. And I think, if there's anybody who's sitting there thinking about ETA or buying a business, like I would probably say if you've never managed people before, I probably wouldn't want owning a small business to be your first experience managing people, right? Because people are by far the most difficult part of this, right? Like the operational stuff, the system stuff is like, it's all easy in the grand scheme of things, but like it requires people to sort of like execute. And if you're not a good coach, if you're not a good, if you're not a good coach, if you're not a good leader on, how to motivate them to do that, then like it's going to be an absolute disaster. And it's difficult. It's difficult. It does take an emotional toll on you. There's like, as a business owner, there's high stress, like the buck stops with you and you can never turn your brain off, right? Even in the seasonal business, I know I'm going to be thinking about mosquitoes and Mosquito Joe in December, right? Even though I'm not operating, I know I'll still be thinking about it. And it's not bad per se. It's just different. And you have to sort of like be ready for that.
Jesse, let me follow up that thought with, can you give us an example of any of the kind of people episodes that you've had to really give some color to this warning?
Yeah. I mean, I won't get into specifics, but I would say like before you buy a business with blue collar workers, you should expect every single one of them to ask you for money, Like I had to come up with sort of like principles for, principles for lending money, very quickly.
Personally.
Right? Personally. And so whether it's like, and more of it happened to be like, hey, like, can I get paid weekly instead of biweekly? I have an expense coming up, or something like that. Like one guy was like, hey, like I need this money today. Can I pay it back over 3 paychecks? Something like that. So you have to sort of like deal with them on a one-off basis, but like you should expect everybody is going to ask you for money, right? And you need to come up with principles for how you're going to handle that. Like I had one guy say like, hey, my cell phone's going to get turned off. Can I use my fuel card, to pay for my cell phone bill, and then I'll pay you back next paycheck. Like you need to prepare for those, right? Like I didn't think about that before, but like that's the reality. And so I was able to sort of like talk with other people and then come up with some like principles for that. But like, yeah, like those are tough. Those are tough conversations.
And Jesse, what are the principles? I mean, we don't need to do a deep dive, but just because I'm just wondering, like I have no idea. So directionally, give us a sense of how this is dealt with.
I think for me, like it depends on one, the caliber of the employee and their sort of like integrity, right? I think what I've felt comfortable doing is if somebody has a need for money, I don't lend money. Like if you're like, I need $1,000, like I'm sorry, I won't do that. But like if you need an advance on your paycheck and I know you're not going to run away next paycheck, like I'm open to doing that for the right people, in the right circumstances, right? So like if you need more than 3 paychecks to pay me back, like sorry, like that's too much exposure for me, There was one guy who asked for a loan who I said no to, but I said, look, your mid-season bonus is coming up, 3 weeks from now. I'm willing to give you that now, as long as you don't leave, and will that help? And he was like very appreciative, and it was a calculated risk on my part to know that like, or to trust that this guy wasn't going to leave me in 3 weeks before he was eligible for his bonus, and he didn't. Yeah. So it worked out. Yeah. But I think that built some loyalty with him, that I was able to do that, because in my mind, it was money he'd already earned or already would earn, and I'm happy to sort of like front that for you, but I'm not going to give you a loan and work on like a 2-year long repayment or anything like that.
Yeah. It's interesting. I might have guessed that the guidance here is just, it's a hard no every time. But I guess you should be prepared to have some nuance and say yes sometimes and no others, and set up conditions, because that means every time you get the request, you really have to devote mental energy to thinking about how you're going to treat it.
True. And I'm a little bit like being a hypocrite here, but every time this has come up with somebody, I said, look, I'm willing to do this, but like, do not talk about this. Like, do not tell anybody else. Like, this is between me and you, right? Now I'm saying this on a podcast, so it's public. But, I tried to make sure that they were at least discreet with it. And if they're not, then like, it's only going to go back and, that'll do damage to them and their reputation if they are broadcasting it. But I've tried to handle it quietly with, the limited number of times it's come up. But like, it's been a limited number of times, but with like 3 or 4 different people,
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's really, I think a lot of people wouldn't expect that, because that does not happen in the corporate world. At all,
exactly.
Yeah.
Or even like, take a situation like this. We had a customer call in, and he said, hey, like your guy was here like way too fast. There's no way he could have completed the service. And so our office staff was like, hey, like no problem. We'll just like, we'll send the guy back and he can go, spend some more time on your property. And so office called the technician and said, hey, can you go back to this guy's house? Like he said you weren't there long enough. Can you just like do another touch up so he feels better about it? And the guy said, no, I was there long enough. What do you do? Right? Yeah. Like, real situation that happened, and we had to handle that separately. But like, things like that will happen because, yeah, like this is not the corporate world, like where people generally say yes and will, do what they're asked. Sometimes they'll just say no and not do what they're asked, and then you have to be forced to handle it.
And how did you handle that one, Jesse?
We pulled them aside and just basically said, look, like when the office asks you to do something, like it's not optional. Like this is what you do, and if you can't listen and follow instructions, then like you don't have a place here. It's pretty simple.
Mm-hmm. What else did you want to make sure that we touched on, Jesse?
Yeah, I think, the last thing, I think one of my biggest learnings and something I'm still sort of reflecting on now was I do feel like I gave up a little bit too much during the transition due to fear. And what I mean by that is, I had some returning people that were coming back, and there's a lot that I don't know. And so I feel like I need to leverage them a lot for my learning. And, everybody's asking for a raise, right? Which is like the biggest thing. And a raise or like a separate sort of like arrangement. And, there was one guy in particular who was super vocal about it or super pushy about it. And I wanted to say no, but I felt like I was so dependent on this person that ultimately, before I ever worked a day with this guy, I caved and gave into his request. And because I felt like I couldn't, like he would walk if I didn't. And it feels like that was the wrong call now that we've worked together for long enough. And it's been fine. But I feel like I was a little like, I should have pushed back more by saying like, dude, you can ask me that, but like, I've never worked with you. So like, no, like I can't give in to this request, but I didn't feel like I was in the position where I could have done that, but hindsight 2020, I probably should have pushed back more and say like, look, I totally get it and happy to reassess after X, Y, and Z time or, something like that. But, that was a call that I made, which I probably would have done differently if I could do it again.
Well, the question here is like, is that generalizable advice? Maybe you have found out in retrospect that this guy, whatever his request was, ultimately wasn't worth conceding. But I wonder if it could have turned out the other way, that it was a good call. I'm trying to understand if that is something that you would generalize to people in the transition, have confidence in yourself and say no a lot more, or just happen to be this way in this case.
So there's another instance like, they asked for something different, but I did cave and it's worked out really well. And so like, I just think that you do need to have, you should feel comfortable to go with your gut, right? In the beginning. Okay. And don't feel like just because like you're going to get asked 1,000 different things as a new owner and like, you don't have to say yes to everything, I think is the biggest way that I could sort of like summarize it. It's okay to say like, I need some time to think this over before I make any changes. And that's fine. And you should feel comfortable doing that.
One technique I've heard is when you come in your day one speech, you basically just announce like no changes for 6 months, no raises for 6 months. Maybe it's not 6 months, maybe it's less, but you just kind of nip all of that in the bud. Now, I'm not actually advocating this technique, and I couldn't even point you to interviews where guests have mentioned doing that, but I do recall it. And so, how does that land on you? Does that feel like something that you could have done, or that wouldn't have flown?
So I didn't have a day one speech because when I closed on the business, I had no employees, right? So everybody was laid off. So, I don't think that's bad advice by any means. Like, I think that's fair to sort of like be transparent and say that to everybody so everybody can hear. I think my situation was a little different because I had no employees and, in the off season before they were employed by me, I had a couple meetings with people. And so I could sort of like meet them and, I know that they were checking me out as much as I was checking them out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that was fine. I probably in those sort of like one-off meetings should have had something like that prepared where I talked about like, hey, like, no changes for the first 90 days or something like that. Like, it's hard to say 6 months because that's like more than half my season.
That's your season.
Yeah. That's something I probably should have handled a little bit differently.
Well, this has been great. You're thoughtful as always. A really packed episode. Thanks a lot for coming back on, Jesse, to share with us about your experience with Mosquito Joe. How do you prefer people reach out?
Two ways. I'm on Twitter. I think I'm at Sunquist. I'm not as active now as I used to be, but they can find me on Twitter. And then also you can just email me at jesse@mountsophia.capital, which was the LLC that I created when I started. And now I'm kind of stuck with because I created it and I acquired with it, and now has nothing to do with mosquitoes, which is confusing for some people, but that's what I'm using. So
great. Thanks a lot, Jesse Sunquist.
All right. Thanks, Will.
I hope you enjoyed that interview. Make sure you subscribe to the Acquiring Minds channel below. We are now publishing twice a week, so tons of new interviews and stories to come. Stories that will help you along your own path to acquiring a business.